We love Wikipedia. It's a great website if you want to get a first overview of a topic. And Wikipedia is a utopia come true. Co-founder Jimmy Wales wants it to become the sum of all human knowledge. Freely accessible, crowdsourced, and anyone can participate. Sounds almost too good to be true, right?
It is not the sum of all human knowledge. It is not yet anywhere close to the sum of all human knowledge, even if we were to assume that the sum is even possible.
This is Anasuya Sengupta. She was born in India. She is a long-time Wikipedian and has been an editor for the online encyclopedia for more than 15 years. She also worked for Wikimedia, the non-profit organization that runs Wikipedia. But she is also a harsh critic. And as an activist, she founded the organization Whose Knowledge, aiming to make the knowledge of marginalized communities accessible on the internet.
I think the biggest problem that Wikipedia has at the moment is a lack of willingness from many of its oldest and most experienced editors to recognize that knowledge, at the heart of knowledge, is power.
The online encyclopedia Wikipedia is continuously written and edited by volunteers. In fact, anyone can add new entries or edit existing ones. To avoid malpractice, the community monitors all changes and, if necessary, deletes them. This is usually done by very experienced users.
When we go onto Wikipedia, what we see is the result of, extraordinary labor by incredible volunteers. And at the same time, most of it still represents a very, very thin slice of the human world. So, for instance, if I was to go onto Wikipedia and look for events or people that I have been inspired by as a young woman in India, I would rarely find them.
Problem number one, the gender gap. Female perspectives are underrepresented on Wikipedia.
What is known as the gender gap is essentially two things. One, that there's a content gap around issues related to women, gender non-conforming, non-binary folks on Wikipedia. And secondly, that there's a contributor gap. Only 1 in 10 editors is projected to self-identify as female. So with both the content and the contributor gap, what you get is a tremendous overpowering primacy of what is primarily male content from Europe and North America.
There are several reasons for this. One of them is time. According to some studies, women simply have less time in their lives to sit at the computer. The division of labor that is taking place in many patriarchal and formerly patriarchal societies continues in the online world. And that's not the only example of an overlap between analog and digital disadvantage.
Wikipedia works like any enlightenment-driven encyclopedia does. It expects to have reliable sources like books or journal articles or well-known newspapers. But all of these things are predicated on publishing's own gender gap.
That's why the relevance of articles about women or female topics is much more difficult to prove. An example. Canadian physicist Donna Strickland was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2018 and had no Wikipedia entry at that time, despite a 30-year scientific career. Problem number two, the Global South gap. Global South is an umbrella term for countries that aren't part of the traditionally industrialized nations. They make up the majority of people, not just on the planet, but also on the internet. Around 75% of online users come from the Global South. Nevertheless, Wikipedia has a Global South gap on two levels. First, people from the Global South are significantly underrepresented as editors. Second, Wikipedia's content is unequally distributed. Researchers at Oxford University's Internet Institute have evaluated more than 7 million articles with geotags in different languages and created this map of Wikipedia's geography.
There are more articles about Antarctica than there are about most countries on the African continent. There are articles about every episode of The Simpsons TV series, but not about African people, events, histories, and different forms of knowledge. Similarly, with Asia or with Latin America, when we look at the Global South gap on Wikipedia, essentially what we find is that most of the content on Wikipedia is either mostly about Europe or North America, or even the content that is on the Global South is written from Europe or North America by those who don't understand the regions and its pluralities and richness as much.
Marginalized groups have trouble getting heard on Wikipedia. Anasuya Sengupta has worked with various groups on Wikipedia projects. People from the Dalit community, the lowest caste in Southeast Asian societies, which are considered untouchable, or with a queer group from Bosnia. The experiences are similar.
I think you're right to say that there are different marginalized groups that are trolled and harassed on Wikipedia. Their content, their work is constantly undermined and not recognized.
So, to really be the sum of all knowledge in the world, Wikipedia needs to be more welcoming to different cultures, especially to people from marginalized groups. To achieve this, however, all Wikipedians need to become aware of the knowledge gaps in the encyclopedia.
It is important to remember that not all Wikipedians are trolls and harassers. I have an incredible community of fellow Wikipedians whom I love and respect and admire a great deal. But unfortunately, there are those who particularly bring the politics of their own identities or their own missions in life, their own agendas, onto Wikipedia in ways that can be extremely violent. And so one or two Wikipedians who either are homophobic or are patriarchal or are casteist or are racist can destroy the goodwill, the solidarity, and the hard work of so many others.